Yeah, how are you? My name is Mike Halseth, and I was born and raised in Salem, Oregon. And my father is Wendell Halseth. My mother was Marie Halseth. All of these folks were born and raised in Salem, Oregon. And they were just hardworking people. My father worked in Salem at Bell Telephone, and he worked his way up the ranks of being a lineman to general manager. And he always had an idea about owning his own business. And so he and his brother decided they were going to look around for a business. And then they discovered Breitenbush, the lower resort, which was, we call it the lower, but it was skiffs, because it sat below the upper. So when I say lower, it really wasn't at the time. It was the first resort that you came to, called Breitenbush Hot Springs. And that was skiffs, and then my father and Wayne purchased that resort from skiffs, or whoever owned it. And I remember the signage was really easy because they could just cross off that person's name, paint it a color, and then put theirs right on it, so they didn't have to pay for signage. And so we moved there in about 1954. And they started running that business, rebuilding it, I should say, because everything always needed repaired up there. People were always repairing something that was broken. If it's fixed, leave it alone. If it's broken, then fix it. Don't maintain it, just fix it when it breaks. And so anyway, that's how we got up to Breitenbush Hot Springs. And actually went to school in Detroit, Oregon. And got snowed in there that first year. So we weren't people that bought and just hired people to run a business. We actually lived there and ran the business.
Year round?
Year round, for the first few years. And so it was a lot of work. You worked a lot of hours. We shoveled a lot of roofs up there in snow. So it was a lot of work for a family.
And you have, name your siblings?
I have an older brother, Gerald. Timothy, Wendell Timothy was his name. I had a younger sister named Leslie. And so we all hiked. When that road got snowed in, we had to hike in and out. So those were a lot tougher times than they are today.
You didn't hike in and out to school. That would have been 11 miles one way and 11 miles back.
We did that a few times, believe it or not. But it wasn't on a routine basis. You'd go in 2 weeks, you'd go in, hike in, hand in, because we did homework.
Oh, I see.
So we'd deliver that, they would grade it, and then we would go back. But we always carried food, things with us that we needed to live up there.
And you do most of your schoolwork at Breitenbush?
At Breitenbush,
check-ins
yeah.
In public school. And
deliver it to the school, and they would grade it.
Huh.
So that went on quite a long time that way.
Huh.
Yeah.
And what kind of jobs did you do to maintain the place, and did your brothers or sister have any work in particular specialties when you were up there?
You know, I can recall that, like my brother Tim, he was like this is after we bought Brockman's Mineral Springs.
Right.
The lower resort, they had the grocery store and hotel, but our main thing was, at that resort, was maintenance. We didn't really do as, until we bought that upper, the jobs really started for us, daytime jobs. And so the job that my brother Tim had, he was the lifeguard at the swimming pool. That was his thing. And Jerry, he did a little bit of everything. maintenance things, repairs. And then I was, there was no garbage service up there, but when we bought the place, there was I think it was a 29 Chevrolet flatbed, 1.5, 2-ton truck, big truck. And so I hauled the garbage cans from the resort up to the dump, which was above the road across from the F and G row of cabins. There was a garbage dump up there, a landfill. So my job was to go empty those cans and take them back in that truck. And so I was about 12, 13 years old driving that 1.5, 2-ton truck.
And did your sister have any particular, did she work in a particular area?
She helped my mom mainly. So she didn't necessarily run the pool or doing that other work like that. She was helping my mother.
And your mother did what?
And my mom was the postmistress at the post office there at the store. People could fill in we had a laundromat in those days. That's not there now. But there was a big room full of equipment. Washing machines, water extractors, and they were all made of wood. And this sat below the power plant, close to the river. And I think that actually flooded out at some point in time, and they never rebuilt it. But when we lived there, we supplied all the sheets, pillows, pillowcases, towels, everything. Dish towels, you name it.
Now the pool and the bathhouse, those were fully functional during the Halseth years there?
Those were fully functional. Fact is, we added a men's and women's shower room just for the swimming pool. The swimming pool was a huge success for us up there, always was. It was always full, and we were always making a lot of money at that pool. That was my job, is to collect the money for the swimming pool. But that wasn't in the beginning. My first job was the garbage thing. And then I moved on to running that pool. And so I know it was a huge success.
Now, some people call this the mini mall, that your dad built this. This wasn't a Bruckman thing.
That was not a Bruckman thing. I think their store was up by the hotel.
Right, it collapsed with snow and then fire in 49 or 50.
Yeah, and that fire took down the building, but it didn't destroy the floor.
Right.
That floor became a dance floor.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they actually, my father and a couple other people moved that floor down to become the dance floor.
Huh.
It was a dance floor up there too, but we took it down behind the store and put it into place down there.
So you had a dance floor down near
close to that grocery store.
And tell me about how this was constructed with moving the cabins.
The cabins, they were like the G row. There was a few cabins left up there, and those cabins were drugged down. My father had it was a 4x4 military ambulance. It was armor plated, so it had a lot of weight, and that thing pulled those cabins one at a time and interlocked with the center piece. So after he drug all the cabins and lined them up in the front, those cabins, by the way, were put on a skid. You jack the cabins up, put them on the skid, and then you drug that skid with that army rig. And once
that would have been crossing the Breitenbush River. Right?
Yeah, that river had a bridge above this section, above the O-row cabins.
Right.
There was a concrete bridge there, really nice bridge, and that was washed out. So these cabins came across that bridge before that was wiped out.
Right.
This was back in like 57, 56, right. 57.
Right.
And then he bought a lot of these, they called them quarter rounds, I think. They look like logs, which you can see in the photo, but they're only about that thick. They're only about 1.5 inches thick. So those were nailed on in the fronts with the framework to give you a false front.
Right.
That upper section looks like it's a deck, but it wasn't. It was just a cover over the deck below.
And you had what, an art shop?
You had an art shop, and people could display their art there. If they had art for sale, it went in there.
Then post office?
That was the post office. The next building in line was the post office, and those are just behind that false front. Those are cabins.
And next, the general store.
The general store, which had it had ice rooms. That was they didn't have refrigeration at that time. You'd bring in block ice, 500, 1,000, 2,000 pounds of ice, and that would keep things refrigerated, like soda pop, beer, wine, whatever you needed in there.
Then next you had a barber shop.
There was a barber shop, and my grandfather ran that barber shop. He had a chair in there, and he had all of his equipment.
And lastly, a soda shop?
That was a soda shop, and in there they would make hamburgers, hot dogs, French fries, things like that.
Right. Good. So tell me more about staying over the winter. You did your schooling.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of challenges? Cleaning the snow off the roofs.
Yeah, we shoveled snow off of all the roofs, including the hotel. We actually lived in that hotel the first year, first couple of years actually. The snow got so deep one winter, we had to, well, we're walking in and out, but we're walking on about 8-9 feet of snow. And that snow would freeze, and then that was the best time really to walk on it. But we would walk from Detroit to Breitenbush, which is about 11 miles on top of that snow. These are some real serious challenges. But one great thing about that walking was when that froze about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, it would freeze like concrete. So you could actually walk right across the top of it at 2 o'clock in the morning, and or you could ride a bicycle, or whatever, and so you could get in and out to Detroit fairly fast.
But there wasn't any snowmobiles or snow cats, anything like that?
Well, if they had them, we didn't have them.
Right.
So yeah, it was, I remember one time we walked out of there, the sun was starting to come up, and the family was kind of scattered out through one flat, they called it the flats, and I stepped on a soft spot and I fell about 10 feet. When I got down to the bottom, I could look all directions as far as the eye could see. The road would heat up and melt the snow up about 3 feet, so you could see each direction as far as you could see. And I was yelling, and nobody could hear me because I was down inside this hole. So they came back and they started searching. Where are you? Well, I was yelling up through that hole, through the snow, and they finally found me. And then I had to try to they got a stick or a log or something, shoved it down, I was able to climb out. Another time we hiked out, you could see an area maybe 10 by 10 that there was no snow, but everywhere else there was 9 feet. And we took our shoes and socks off and put our feet into this mud, and it was like the hot spring. One of those hot springs was actually halfway out to Detroit. You couldn't see a hot spring, but the road was steaming, warm. So we got our feet nice and warm in that area. But those are some of the challenges that we had.
Now toward the end, I think, of the Halseth time up there, there was a Columbus Day storm on October 12th, 1962. Do you have any recollections of that storm and what damage it did to the place?
You know, I was here in Portland during that storm in 1962, and it was pretty bad.
Right.
But I was not at Breitenbush. It was just before I joined the military. So I didn't go back up there in 62.
So would your brothers or sister maybe have been there?
My oldest brother, who was married, and he was living for a while in Salem. So I'm not sure he was up there either. Now my sister may have a recollection after that, yeah.
But by that time, what, you and your brother were joining the military,
Yeah.
and your dad didn't have the maintenance support that he did earlier. Tell me about kind of the end of the Halseth years up there.
Well, in '62, I joined the military in November of '62, and so did my other sibling, which was Wendell Timothy. And my older brother was married, living in Salem, not working at the resort now. And I think it put a lot of load on my father because we were quite a labor force. Even though we were young, we did a lot of work at the resort. These were not high-paying jobs, but they were jobs that supported the family during that time. And so once we left, joined the military, I think he had to hire people to do all of those jobs. And it was quite a stress on him. And I think it made him think maybe he should consider selling the resort. In fact, as I know it did. One person can't do all that work unless you hire it.
So it became less economical to run the resort, and you just think that the time came for him to sell out.
Yeah, I think the time came, and he actually found a buyer. I never met the people, but I know of their last name is all.
Well, you mentioned that they were the Whites.
The White was their last name.
Because in one of the articles I have, it says the Wrights, W-R-I-G-H-T.
Oh, the Wrights.
So it's so close. I think.
Yeah, I think it's probably Wrights. Yeah.
And
you're right.
I've barely found a little bit of information on Harold T. Wright, but I have no biography on him yet, so I don't know what's going on after the Halseth years.
Well, I could just say that every year there was always something going on. The high river, there was always floods. Logs would build up above the resort somewhere between maybe Breitenbush Lake and there, and then they would wash out in high water like snow melt. Mm-hmm. And it could wipe out a bridge, could wipe out the bathhouse, swimming pool. It could be very disheartening unless you're willing to come in and put a lot of labor.
Right.
And put it back where it was.
Right.
Fact is, I remember when we first bought the upper resort from Merle Brockman, there was no power. There was the flume had been partially washed out. The bridge was washed out from that lower section across to where the swimming pool was. There was just a lot of things that needed to be fixed and repaired. We did all those things with the help of that power wagon rig, because you could drag a log. My father and I was watching him. There was a 6-inch strap, a belt that went around from pulley to pulley in the power plant. That was all broken. And he got some leather string and sewed this leather back up, poured some hot wax across the leather, and made it work. And I have one cute story that I want to tell you about. When we were running that upper resort, my father had control of the power plant, but what my grandfather on my mom's side would have been her father. He was up there doing some maintenance work, and somebody'd see the lights get bright, so my father would go up there and turn it down because he didn't want to stress out that generator. So he'd turn the power down. My grandfather would say, "Hey, there's something wrong. I gotta go." So he'd turn it back up.
Yeah.
So these people were just steady, going back and forth, turning it up, turning it down. So you could always see the lights getting brighter, getting dimmer, getting brighter, getting dimmer. And the only time they really would go dim on their own is if that flume filled up with wood. Sticks, wood, people sometimes throw things in.
Right.
They'd wind up down in the impeller.
Right.
So you'd have to actually stop the power plant, climb down, pull out all that sticks, pull out all that lumber, then fire it back up, and now you had a really good system. And that system, I think, is still running today.
I think it's a 1920 Sullivan turbine.
Yeah, that's what it is.
I've been on the system tour a couple
yeah,
of times.
That's it.
And I hear from Betty Bruckman that it was DC power during the Bruckman years. Nowadays it's AC power.
Oh.
But I don't know if it was probably still DC
It was
power.
DC.
It was?
There were little cards at every power outlet everywhere. It says, do not plug any AC appliances in here. You'll burn them up. People did, and they always wanted my father to pay for it.
So the DC power ran what? Lights?
It ran all the lights. It ran, well, there were power outlets in all the cabins. You could, if you had a DC component, it would run it. Yeah, and the card says, do not plug anything in unless.
Right.
So some things were AC, DC in those days.
I see.
You could run either one.
Okay.
So yeah, that was quite a deal. And
So,
DC stands for direct current.
Right.
AC stands for alternating current.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a guy up at Breitenbush who wanted another kind of historian, the Breitenbush historian. He had a couple of questions he wanted me to ask you.
Okay.
Who owned the Northland, or 60 or so acres north of our staff road? So on the north side, north of the mini mall. I don't know what he's exactly what parcel he's talking about.
Well, there was like 160 acres up there that my father had control of.
Right.
The road that went past this was on the land.
Right.
The left side of that were some horse corrals.
Right.
And I know the people that ran those at the time.
Right.
So I'm not 100% sure those horse corrals were on the resort land. I think they were. Then if you turn to the right there and went across that bridge, you'd be heading towards the hotel.
Right.
That was all Breitenbush Resort land.
Right. So you're not aware of some other owner who owned 60 acres up there?
No. The only thing I did know is there were easements, property easements. But that's not ownership.
It was for the Forest
utility
Service
for Forest Service. That's right.
Right. Okay.
So this land, I'm not totally sure where he's talking about.
Yeah. Maybe you can come up and talk to him in person.
Yeah, that's fine.
Do you know if your parents logged any while you were up there?
No, they did no logging whatsoever up there when we had the resort. Although we did get a lot of firewood for those sheds.
Right.
We had to fill those with 12 cord sheds every winter. But we wouldn't get that off the resort. That came off actually Forest Service land. Trees that were already down, that kind of a thing.
Now, was there some cinnabar mining near natural pools? I guess when I've done some Google searches, I've seen some references to cinnabar.
I don't know of anything like that.
Yeah.
There were always stories going around that somebody wants to mine this, or they want to do that, this or that.
Right.
But that's all they seem to ever be.
Okay.
Like maybe this is one of those.
Now, it may have been after your time there, but I think it was December 63, January 64, when the big flood, not the Columbus Day storm, but there was a giant flood.
I think that's the one that wiped out that owner that was there at the time.
Right, but that was after.
That was after
ownership transfer.
That's right. I'm sure it was a real eye opener.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because I think that was probably the biggest flood ever done.
Yeah. To come down through there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So tell me, one history, it doesn't even say who wrote this history, says that Wendell was in charge of the upper resort. Wayne his brother was in charge of the lower resort.
That's correct. That's how they
split their duties. But one thing said that they had a falling out, and that was why it was that way. Do you have any knowledge?
No, I don't think there was a falling out.
Right.
They loved each other.
Yeah.
I remember that Merle got a hold of probably Wayne and Wendell, and he wanted to make a deal to sell that upper resort. Wayne didn't want to. They had enough work, he thought. But my father thought, well, maybe this could work. So anyway, there was no falling out except that Wayne didn't want to make the transition.
Right.
He wanted to keep the smaller operation down there.
Right.
So if there was a deal, they made a deal to say, you keep it. pay me off if there was money.
And I found one article that mentions Wayne is still there in 1972, almost 10 years after the Upper Resort. Do you know anything about?
I think he more or less did stay there. Wayne had a really nice employer, Marion Electric in Salem, and he was able to take off the summers, work with his wife and family at that resort, and then in the fall, winter, go back to work for his electric company. So I think he was there, yeah. You know, the lower resort was a lease. That was not owned.
Right, it was Forest Service land.
Yeah, it's Forest Service land.
Special use permit or whatever.
That's right.
Right.
And when the lease is up, it was going to be up forever. And they took that back. The only thing,
Forest Service took it
the
back?
Forest Service took the land back from the lease.
Well, I don't know when they did that, but because there was another sale in '77 to the buyers, B-E-Y-E-R, buyer. Some people from Southern California bought the lower resort. I can share it with you on email if you ever want to see it.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
And so it's possible that Wayne hung on to that thing until '77.
It's very possible.
And so I'm not sure when the permit was ever up.
Yeah, I know it seemed like they were always talking about it running out. And that was the part that my father didn't like. Was having that hanging over your head.
Right.
And then having to destroy the cabins because that's their land once that lease was up.
Or walk away from
Or walk away and they'll take care of it.
They can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right. But there's nothing standing at the lower springs anymore.
No, I don't think there's anything left except maybe some concrete.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to talk about my father up there, the type of jobs that he was able to do, and that was anything. He could repair the power plant, repair plumbing that might be leaking, move those cabins to build that huge lower section there with the cabins that were brought down from the E-row, build a false front on there. If something happened that needed to be fixed, we could fix it. In fact, just one time there were some bathrooms right next to that grocery store. They were for the public bathrooms. And we were in there one day working on the plumbing and a deer walked in. And he just stood there for a few minutes and watched us work and then just walked out. But it was, that's the kind of things, the system all backed up the septic system. And we didn't know where to look, but we knew there had to be holding tanks. You just don't discharge things into the water. And we found the holding tank. We prodded around, found it. Had to call somebody from Silverton to come and pump it. But those are the kind of things, I mean, you have to be able to handle anything, or you may have to pay top dollar for it to get fixed. So that's why we were able to make it a huge success. He always paid his bills up there because he had the income, and we made a really good return for him on their investment. And I think he was really happy working up there. I think it made him really happy because he was always whistling while he was working on something. And the log that diverted the water from the main river at the dam to the flume, that was always gone every year. So he'd have to drag a new log across that river and maybe rebuild the bridge while he was there with that power wagon. He had a military power wagon, and that power wagon could do just about anything because it was armor plated, so it was heavy. And you could drive it across the river if you needed to and drag those logs right behind you. And he actually used that rig to plow the Breitenbush Road. But when we did purchase, there were trucks and cars there, but there were no titles to those cars, so they had to stay on the resort. So we used those cars, but you can never leave the resort with them.
Right.
Yeah.
And have you been back to Breitenbush since the Halseth years?
We went there in 1994. There was a reunion up at the summer homes. A friend of Wayne's actually owned one of those summer cabins, and we went up there and had a nice reunion. Wayne, my father, and all my brothers, we were all there enjoying a really nice sunny day.
So what did your dad and his brother Wayne do after their Halseth years? Did your dad do a trout farm?
Yes, after he sold to the right, he actually bought a disrepaired trout farm out of Seaside. And he did the same thing at Breitenbush. He restored everything to it's the way it's supposed to be, and actually hatched fish there. And I think it was the Nicanicum River that flowed along and flowed through pools for U-catch. So he did a U-catch right on the main highway. And then a realtor came up after he'd been there 2 or 3 years and said, I've got some people that were looking for a place like this. And they started talking, and the gentleman says, they own the Zigzag store at Zigzag, Oregon. And they might even be willing to trade. Let me talk to, anyway, they talked, they made a trade. Those people took over the trout farm because he was fully stocked and ready to sell fish. And he took the Zigzag store.
Huh.
And they were there until my mother died. And then he, at that point, sold it.
Right.
But it was another one of these older businesses that needed a lot of work, but he fixed it up. And it had a grocery store, which he was already used to running.
Right.
It had a gas station, an Arco gas station there. Had several cabins, rental cabins. Same type of business.
Huh.
No hot springs though.
Right.
But it was a great location, and most people that live around here know where Zigzag is.
Right.
And when he got there, there was hardly any inventory. And when he left, you couldn't find any, everything was full. There was no place to put any more inventory. So, and then when he sold it, he had he had all of his income that he needed through his retirement years from the sale of that.
And how about his brother Wayne? Do you know, after he left the lower resort, maybe in '77 or so, where did he go?
Well, until he retired, he went back to Salem.
He did.
But until his retirement years, he actually worked for Marion Electric.
Okay.
You know, he had a good employer and worked for them for many, many years. All right. I know you were interested in maybe the horse facilities they had up there, and they had several corrals. They would lease out that area for a monthly fee. So whoever was up there, which the first year was Gene Ware. Gene Ware was from Silverton, and he'd bring in a couple of big trucks full of horses. And these horses were for trail riding. So he would collect the rents. It's an hourly rate, whatever. And they would take these trails up to the gorge, up by the power lines, many different trails they already had set in place. And he came up there for several years, and the father leased it to him. And then after Gene Ware said, well, you know, I'm getting old, I can't come up anymore, another gentleman named Shepherd, he had the same type of an operation where they'd bring horses up to ride by an hourly rate. And so you might be on a trail, he might have 8-10 horses on a trail, and the horses were pretty stable because they're walking on trails 1.5 feet wide, and you might be in a canyon, so they were fairly stable. No matter, you know, whenever you rode those horses, they weren't anxious to get on the trail, but they were anxious to come back because that's where the food, the hay and alfalfa was. So anyway, this was a yearly thing. It went on the whole time we were there. They would lease that space out in the summertime for fee for riding.
Now, another thing we were talking about Villa Maria. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Villa Maria, there was a Father Neugebauer from Silverton. He actually wasn't Silverton, it was the next town over. That was where the church was. And he would come up there. He had a summer home, summer cabin. It was more than just a cabin. He had a church facility there and many facilities for sleeping, many groups there. And so he basically, we went to church there on weekends. And I was an altar boy for a while, so I worked with Father Neugebauer directly. And then some nuns from the church could come and they could stay there. It's some fairly large facilities. I believe they're gone now, but it was quite an operation during the times that he came there. And I believe that he used his own money to improve the facilities as they need it, because they could be washed out at times as well from floods. But my father and he just became pretty good friends. Yeah, I was just going to mention that during the time that my father sold the property, the folks that purchased that property didn't pay my father any funds from the sale. He was to receive income from the sale of that property, but he didn't receive any. They just didn't pay him. And I remember that after Brockman got that property back, he called my father many times and asked him, could you take that property back over? Because while my father had that property, he always made his payments like clockwork. And Mr. Brockman always remembered that. And I think that when the other people either left the property, they left the contract, they left everything. He may have gone bankrupt, I'm not 100% sure. But the property was sitting there, and Merle Brockman called my father and said, will you run that property? Take it back over. And my father was already involved in some other business and was not able to do that at that time. But he always, over the years, always said it was the greatest thing, the greatest comfort, knowing, even though that guy didn't make his payments, that Brockman always felt secure with Dad. That was a really nice thing. Very rewarding.
And back in those days, the contracts were between two people. There wasn't a bank involved,
yeah,
right?
That is correct. There were no banks involved. The owner of a property would sell that property to a person on a contract. Today they call that paper. And that paper sometimes doesn't have the value. In other words, there's no instrument for foreclosure that I know of. You would have to personally go after that person and sue them for the money. And so things were done differently in those days, and I'm glad that we have banking systems today in place for purchases and sales.
So during the Bruckman era, they had masseuses in the bathhouse. Did that continue during the Halseth time?
Yes, that continued during the Halseth time. They had male masseuses for the men's side, and they had a female for the women's side. Bathtubs, showers, those hot bed tables. They had all it was always busy. I worked at the pool collecting the money for the swimming pool, but they collected their own money in those.
Okay.
We didn't collect it out there.
And you were living up there year-round. What did you do for entertainment up there? Pretty isolated.
We were pretty isolated. We had a piano in the hotel at the upper resort. We had a piano at the lower, and so you could jump in and play some music anytime you chose to. But my father had his own band. There was 4 or 5 piece band, and so he was also the entertainment at those dance places, the dance floor that we talked about at Breitenbush. That was the entertainment on Friday and Saturday nights. It got so big there wasn't, they either had to build a bigger floor or they had to like calm down a little bit because there was just so many people.
That was a live band.
That was, yeah, live band. It was a huge draw.
Huh.
And then in the wintertime, when things were pretty slow, he came up with an idea of going to the Detroit high school, grade school, and putting together some musical acts that then you could bring in all the family members and they could sit and hear their children play music. And so he would come and interview each child and see what talent that they had. Do you dance? Can you play a musical instrument? Can you sing? All these kids, they all could do something. It may not have been a big act that you might see today, but in those days, it was a big deal. Now, one kid, I remember she could do the Charleston. Well, that's enough. So anyway, he'd line up all these acts, and then one after the other, they would come out on the stage at the high school and do their act. And there's another thing that kept getting bigger and bigger. There weren't enough chairs to seat all of the people that came to that well, I guess it was a basketball floor. Anyway, they filled that place up. So that's what he did in the wintertime for several years, including bringing that band that he had, bringing them from Salem up to Detroit and doing a little swing music.
So did he have a band at Breitenbush, or was it a Salem band?
It's a Salem band, but they came to Breitenbush every Friday and Saturday night and played.
I see.
And it was another one of these things that just kept getting, there was just so many people.
Mm-hmm.
They all came for the music.
And that dance floor was behind all the little storefronts.
Yeah, all the storefronts. If you were to walk, if looking at the buildings, if you walked off to the right, you'd run right into the dance floor. It was back there about 30 feet. Built around a tree or two. It was really nice.
Well, let's look at some of your photos, and maybe we'll think of something else to talk about.
Well, there is one quick thing I'd like to add, which is kind of a cute thing, really.
Okay.
The piano was played so much outside and moved around so much that it really got detuned.
Mm-hmm.
And so we thought, well, we got to call somebody in Silverton and have that thing tuned up. Well, in the meantime, there was a forest fire that had started between Breitenbush and Detroit. And so you could see this fire from the Breitenbush Road. You weren't driving through it, but you could see it. So we're going to haul that piano to have it tuned up in Silverton. And in the paper it came out they're evacuating Breitenbush Mineral Springs because somebody saw that piano going down the road.
Oh.
We weren't evacuating at all.
Right.
We were simply tuning the piano.
Right. Okay. Say, did you mention that maybe it was at the lower resort you lost some buildings to fire or something at some point?
The house, one of the homes that we lived in after we first moved, we're staying there at the resort through the winter, going to school at Detroit. There were a fire. These were old cabins, very brittle, very dry, and our parents came and said, we've got to go back because our cabin burnt down.
Uh-huh.
So that was really an eye-opener because everything we owned was in that cabin, including our clothes.
At the lower resort?
At the lower resort.
Uh-huh.
And then it was a good location and it made money. So he had one of his family members and himself included, and they built a brand new cabin on that site. And then Wayne would continue to rent that out after we moved to the upper. Very nice cabin.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.